The floral invoice was tucked inside a manila envelope labeled Final Reconciliations, Karina and James. I wasn't supposed to see it. It was in my mother's filing cabinet bottom drawer, under tax documents she asked me to scan while she ran to the store. But when I lifted the flap, something slid out. White paper, gold-embossed logo, $28,463.72, paid in full, drawn from a closed account I recognized immediately. My trust fund. Not metaphorical, not emotional. The actual legally titled tax-sheltered trust fund that was created when I was 12 after Grandma Louise passed and left me her estate in Oregon. It was modest, just over $80,000, structured to mature when I turned 25, for grad school, a business, something substantial. The last time I'd checked the balance, it was intact. That was 11 months before Karina's wedding, and this invoice, itemizing white peonies, eucalyptus runners, and imported orchids from Amsterdam, was dated 5 weeks before the ceremony. I didn't react, not visibly. I refiled the envelope, closed the drawer, finished scanning the tax files. When my mother returned, I handed her the flash drive and asked if she wanted a second copy backed up to the cloud. She smiled, called me efficient as always, and said no, said she trusted me. I was 25. My name is Marianne Holt. I was working part-time at a community library in Montclair, commuting twice a week for paralegal certification courses, and planning to apply to Georgetown's master's program in political economics. My recommendation letters were ready. My admissions essay was written. I just didn't have the tuition anymore. Karina's wedding had been extravagant. She married James Cartwright, whose LinkedIn tagline read, Growth Hacker Legacy Builder, CEO at Cartwright Labs. They had drone footage, a violin quartet, a weekend itinerary that included wine tasting, and a farewell brunch with calligraphed menus. My role was support, which meant dress steaming, phone charging, errand running. The day after the wedding, my mother hugged me and said, "You're such a great sister. You always understand." I nodded. Because I did understand. I understood that the trust was gone, and that the family didn't see it as theft. They saw it as optimization, moving capital from someone who was still figuring things out to someone who had a life that was already happening. Karina was golden. She always had been. Honor roll, prom queen, first job at an NGO that existed more in brand than in outcome. She spoke in vision boards and was always between wellness retreats. When she got engaged, my parents called it a strategic match. When I mentioned grad school, they called it a maybe. Later that night, I asked my father about the trust, calmly. No accusation. He didn't lie. He said, "We made a call." The timing was tight. Karina's vendor deadlines didn't line up with the bond liquidity. I asked if they planned to replace the money. He said, "We'd hoped you wouldn't notice." But yes, over time. I asked if they thought I'd approve. He said, "We figured you'd understand." They always use that word. Understand. As if my silence was consent, as if the absence of reaction was the presence of agreement. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I just said, "Thanks for the clarification," and walked upstairs. I opened my laptop, deleted my Georgetown application, then opened a new browser tab, typed in, "Entry-level legal jobs, NYC, no degree required." I didn't feel rage. I felt clarity. Not fire, not even cold, just structure. If they saw me as optional, then I'd make sure I became an equation they couldn't solve. Karina's framed baby photos filled the house. Mine lived in a folder labeled Archive. She got violin lessons, birthday banners, and Facebook posts. I got gift cards and polite nods. I used to think independence mattered more than attention, but invisibility has a cost. Because when they stole my future, they called it optimization, for Karina's branding photo shoot, for the legacy marriage, for the image. I still remember the night they announced the wedding venue, some vineyard on a hill with a pre-built Pinterest board and a custom fire pit. My dad toasted to strategic decisions. My mom called it an investment in a lifetime. I looked down at the lasagna I'd brought, made with bulk mozzarella and discount basil from the farmer's market, because that week I couldn't afford grocery delivery. I remember her laughing mid-toast, "This is going to be the kind of event we'll tell our grandkids about." I remember my mother nodding, eyes shining. No one asked if I was okay with using my education money for flowers flown across time zones, because I was practical, quiet, understanding. That word again. At age 15, I scored in the 98th percentile on the PSAT. My father skimmed the printout and said, "Don't let it go to your head." At 18, I turned down prom to help with tax prep. Karina told everyone it was because I didn't vibe with dances. At 22, I got into a research fellowship in DC but declined it to care for my mom during her surgery recovery. She called me a lifesaver, never reimbursed the flight. At 25, they spent my fund, and no one said thank you, because I was never framed as the one with potential. I was the stabilizer, and stabilizers don't need windfalls. They need to be there when the main act stumbles, so I let them believe it. For a while, I took a courier job in Brooklyn, long nights, legal paperwork, silence. Within 2 years, I'd worked my way into private equity, drafting memos, managing discovery logs, and quietly rebuilding what they drained. I named my savings account Marianne Trust 2.0. Karina never asked. She assumed I was still finding myself. I let her think that, because she was the kind of person who mistook silence for submission, and I was the kind of person who took inventory of debts, of receipts, of patterns. The month she celebrated her first anniversary with James, I made my first private equity investment through a pooled microfund. It was small, just under $10,000, a logistics startup doing cold chain optimization. I didn't care about the product. I cared about the paperwork. Every clause I read was a weapon. Every shareholder agreement was a weapon. Every undervalued founder with poor legal counsel was a lesson. That's what Karina never understood. She had the spotlight, but I had the blueprints. And the moment I saw their marriage start to crack, James pulling back from social media, Karina posting "choose peace" quotes, I didn't feel pity. I felt momentum. Because I knew what was coming, and I was already positioned to catch it. The trust dissolution paperwork had my name on every page. I requested it from our family's estate planner under the pretense of wanting to learn more about my legal rights. She was polite, said it was refreshing to see a young woman taking initiative. She emailed me the full file within 48 hours. I printed every page, highlighted every lie. It wasn't just the $80,000, it was how it was done, backdated signatures, a vague memo of family realignment countersigned by my parents, a clause triggered that allowed early withdrawal in case of urgent familial necessity, which, according to an addendum, had been defined as unforeseen ceremonial costs. Ceremonial, not medical, not educational, not even survival. Karina's wedding counted as an emergency. I flipped to the justification letter. It was brief, 6 sentences, written by my father, filed by their attorney. It referenced Marianne's current gap year, said I had no formal plans for postgraduate study, and that liquidation was in the best interest of both beneficiaries. Both, Karina and me. Except she got a chandelier tent flown in from New Zealand, and I got nothing. Not even notification. The worst part wasn't the betrayal, it was how cleanly it had been executed. No emotion, just legalese, just the flick of a pen. That was when I stopped assuming they'd ever apologize. People don't apologize for what they rationalize. They'd rewritten the story in their heads so thoroughly that I was no longer someone who'd lost something. I was someone who didn't need it in the first place. My mother said it first. It's not like you had a concrete plan. You're still figuring things out. She said this while trimming flowers in the kitchen. The same kitchen I'd cleaned after every dinner. The same kitchen I'd cooked in during her recovery. The same kitchen where Karina had once said, "You know what would be perfect for you? One of those maker spaces, like an incubator, but not as intense. Like my ambition was something you needed to pad before sitting on it. My father was more measured. We never said it was gone, just used, temporarily." He said this while reading the Wall Street Journal. Didn't look up, didn't blink, just flipped to the next page. I asked if they planned to repay me. He said, "Your family. We share. It'll balance out." Balance. Like equity was sentimental, like fairness could be bartered in memories and holiday cards. I stopped visiting after that. Didn't block them. Didn't confront them. Just faded. I answered only when necessary. Holidays. Logistics. The occasional tax question they assumed I was still handling. Karina didn't notice. She was too busy staging her life. First anniversary photos, branded partnerships, an Instagram post that read, "Thankful every day that my family made this dream possible." No tag, no citation, just the unspoken assumption that what's given should never be questioned. She sent me a candle that Christmas. Rose gold lid, scent, champagne toast. No card, just a sticker on the bottom that read, "Grateful for you." I took a photo, filed it, not out of sentiment, for documentation, because this wasn't just betrayal anymore. It was evidence. By then, James had started distancing himself. His startup, once more, had missed funding targets 2 quarters in a row. I knew because I watched the VC chatter. I had 3 Slack channels from different funds that monitored pitch decks and term sheet rumors. He'd overextended, started burning bridge capital to keep operating. And when your marriage is built on optics, financial erosion doesn't stay private long. I bookmarked his filings, watched for purchase orders, tracked the startup's IP status. Every time he posted a vague motivational quote, "Failure is feedback," I checked for another red flag. The signs were there, and I wasn't watching idly. I was preparing. Because my name was on the documents they altered, and when the divorce started, when she'd scream about betrayal and broken promises and property splits, I'd be the one holding the page they never expected anyone to read, the one that started it all, the one they thought wouldn't matter. I was 27 when I joined Wilcox and Barrett as a paralegal assigned to private equity portfolios. The office smelled like toner and caution. Everyone wore navy spoken clauses and walked with that quiet urgency that only comes from handling money that doesn't belong to you. I blended in instantly. Didn't talk about background, didn't offer opinions, just formatted documents, checked clauses, flagged inconsistencies, and tracked asset transfers like my life depended on it. Because it did. Grad school had been the plan. Georgetown, political economics, fellowship dreams. But I turned those dreams into line items and started accruing something far more valuable than prestige: proximity. I watched silent negotiations that would never make the press. I saw family-owned businesses gutted in 24 hours because someone didn't read a term sheet. I watched founders lose voting power in their own companies after signing away just 3%. People think revenge is some fiery act of vengeance. It isn't. It's methodical, it's structured, it's legal. I took notes. James Cartwright's company showed up 2 years into my tenure, not in my inbox, not in our client list, in the form of a rumor. A mid-tier fund out of Austin was doing a sweep of consumer tech with burnout potential. Someone in the bullpen mentioned Cartwright Labs as a cautionary tale. I didn't react, but I flagged the name. I pulled every public filing, tracked their cap table through old Series A paperwork, built a shadow dossier just for myself. The structure was fragile. James had diluted equity early to keep the image of expansion alive. That meant his voting power was weaker than he let on. He didn't own the company. He wore it. And the moment he filed for divorce, the cracks would widen, because Karina would want something big, and James didn't have liquidity, only equity. That's the thing about startups. They look like castles, but they're built on sand and borrowed hype. He wouldn't have cash to give her. He'd offer shares. He'd assume she'd be too proud to accept. She wouldn't be. She'd want to win. On paper, so she'd say yes, and then she'd own something she couldn't run, and someone would need to buy her out. I just needed to be ready. At 28, I transferred to a satellite firm specializing in asset realignment during corporate divorces. It wasn't glamorous, but it was precise, and I made sure to be the quietest person in the room who always caught the missing zero. My name never made it to the top of a contract, but my initials were on every clause we buried under subpoints. Meanwhile, Karina's life started to shrink. First, the podcast paused. Then came the inspirational posts about finding stillness during chaos. Then a rebrand. Then nothing. Until the filing. I read it before she told anyone. Public record. Filed under Cartwright versus Cartwright. California. Irreconcilable differences. She wanted half of James's vested assets. Specifically the company, specifically the shares. It wasn't even hidden, just written plainly in the petition, a clause that would transfer 31% of voting shares to her name. She didn't know what that meant, but I did. It meant she could block a merger. It meant she could veto a restructuring. It meant she'd be the most valuable liability on the board. And James, arrogant, frantic, and predictable, would want her out. Cleanly, quietly, fast. I had my chance. I called an old contact, Carla, for the paperwork. I wired the money from a holding company I'd formed a year prior, Riso Capital LLC, Delaware registered. No mention of me. We made the offer. Clean. Above market. No contingencies. Buyout of her share block, contingent on waiver of voting rights and full divestment. She accepted within 48 hours. Thought it was a win. Posted a photo of herself drinking champagne on a rooftop with the caption, "Sometimes you let go of the branch and find you can fly." She never asked who bought the shares, never checked, never imagined the girl whose fund paid for her flowers would one day own the soil beneath her brand. That's the problem with people like Karina. They think image is value. But I knew the truth. Value is leverage. And now I had both. The stock transfer finalized at 10:12 a.m. on a Thursday. I was sitting in my shared office, sipping cold coffee and reviewing a non-disclosure clause for a different client when the confirmation came in. Carla pinged me. "It's done. Shares transferred. You now hold 31.4% voting rights under Riso Capital." I didn't reply. I just stared at the screen. It wasn't satisfaction. It wasn't relief. It was order. Like aligning a picture frame after years of it being tilted slightly left. Karina never knew. James didn't ask. The board didn't care. Just relieved to have the Cartwright domestic disruption chapter closed. In a month's time, I was on the next shareholder call, silent but logged in. James kept using words like growth potential and strategic alignment and brand synergy. He didn't know the second highest voter on that call was the woman he once said wouldn't make it past Etsy. The motion passed because I didn't block it. Not yet. Not because I didn't want to, but because I was still watching. Letting him believe the pressure was off. Letting Karina think she walked away with dignity. Letting my parents continue their lives without ever wondering how their daughter, who never really bloomed, had entered a world they couldn't pronounce, much less navigate. The funny thing is, no one noticed. No Instagram stories, no family rumors. They were still talking about me like I was unemployed, still tagging me in job listings, still telling mutual friends that I was trying something creative. I let them, because while they laughed in group chats and passed around articles about Gen Z burnout, I was restructuring shareholder agreements and helping determine whether $18 million in IP was valued properly. That Christmas, Karina sent a mass email with a subject line that read, 2023 was about letting go. It included a long paragraph about learning to define herself outside of titles and moving away from toxic control structures. I printed it, highlighted the phrase toxic control, filed it under irony, no response, no confrontation, just documentation. My father called on New Year's. He said, "I'm glad to hear you're finding your own pace. Not everything has to be about money." This, from the man who used my education fund to buy party favors. I asked if he'd read any good books lately. He told me about a novel set in Napa. I let him talk, because I was no longer trying to prove anything. Control, I'd learned, isn't about the stage. It's about the switches backstage. And I now owned a master switch to something they didn't even realize had a dimmer. Meanwhile, the Cartwright brand was shifting. James was burning capital. There was talk of pivoting the platform to a subscription model. Another startup cliché born out of desperation. I watched from inside the call logs, watched as he pitched new features, changed department leads, cut costs. Then, one Friday afternoon, an investor asked me, casually, how I felt about the leadership trajectory. I said, needs adult supervision. He laughed, but I wasn't joking. 2 weeks later, I used my voting rights to require a third-party audit before the next funding round. It wasn't punitive. It was practical. The audit revealed overvaluation of user retention data and misreported affiliate metrics. Nothing illegal, just embarrassing and costly. James had to issue a correction in the investor portal. I didn't say a word, didn't gloat, didn't even log in for the follow-up call. But my name, my LLC, was now on the lips of every serious stakeholder. James sent a message to Carla. Would love to understand Reso Capital's long-term vision. We didn't reply. Karina posted a photo of herself holding a book about resilience. Caption, healing is non-linear. I didn't like it, didn't comment, just took a screenshot. Control doesn't need applause, it just needs to be exercised. And by then, I had it in full. The wedding photos still live on the internet. I stumbled across them again during a routine audit of Karina's social links, something I did quarterly, not out of sentiment, but out of habit. Hashtags. Ever after Cartwright. Dream Day. Grateful one image stood out, her on the marble steps of the venue, gold-threaded train behind her, hand over her mouth like she just heard something touching. Caption, funded by love. I saved it, because now, years later, I had the receipts that said otherwise. I had the withdrawal forms, the trust clause citations, the backdated emergency memo, and the expense report she never saw. where every floral arrangement was coded under the line item Opportunity Reallocation. That was the name they gave to gutting my future. It wasn't theft, it was strategy. They had framed it that way from the beginning, like redirecting my education money to her wedding was a shift in momentum, an emotional investment. They had no idea how accurate that framing would become, because I had learned from them. Every betrayal has a paper trail, and every paper trail can be reverse engineered. When I bought the shares out from under Karina, she was legally divested. But I wasn't done. She still held residual rights, brand image, promotional deals, residual licensing. I didn't want those. I wanted the clause that would trigger a default termination of those rights, and James gave it to me. After a funding round fell through, he signed a brand restructuring plan to keep control of his board seat. Part of that plan? Nullification of all unvested licensing and image rights not tied to active involvement. Karina wasn't active. She wasn't even informed. And when the restructuring completed, I called Carla. Sent her the release. It was a standard form. 4 pages, 2 signatures, 1 termination clause. We offered her a $10,000 buyout to waive image and partnership rights. She signed it without asking questions, posted a photo the next day of a bottle of Veuve and a caption, "Some chapters close with peace." Peace, bought with the last of her leverage. I now owned every image tied to that brand's original identity. We didn't use them. We just filed them, buried, erased, no lawsuit, no takedown notices, just quiet replacement, updated logos, neutral copy, and new founders on the About page, none of whom were named Cartwright. When I got the final email from our legal team confirming the purge was complete, I didn't smile. I just opened a drawer in my desk, took out the wedding invitation from 8 years ago and shredded it. Not because I needed closure, but because it had served its purpose. It was a catalyst, not a keepsake. Meanwhile, James's board was flailing. Margins were shrinking. He was proposing a purpose-first rebrand. I stayed silent through every meeting, every pitch deck, every attempt to reignite team spirit, until one investor asked, "Do we believe current leadership can execute?" I replied, "I don't believe he understands what he built, or who paid for it." It was the only sentence I spoke that entire meeting. It was the one that mattered. 3 weeks later, James stepped down as CEO to focus on creative vision. A new interim CEO was named. I approved the vote. He sent one last email to Carla. "No hard feelings, just business." We didn't reply, and that was how the man who told me to think smaller was now pitching self-care products to people I had hired. The wedding he built on my inheritance? A line item on my acquisition sheet. The business he built with arrogance? A brand I now co-owned. And the sister who stood on marble steps? Reduced to a watermark in a brand guide that no one used anymore. The first time they said the fund was a gift, I was 13. We were at brunch, the kind where everyone pretends to like each other long enough to finish the mimosa. My father told the table, "Every responsible parent sets aside something. We're doing that for both our daughters. It's called love and planning." Karina beamed like it was already hers. I remember the phrasing, "both our daughters," like it was equal, like it was certain, like the paperwork wasn't already tilted, because by the time the fund was cashed out, silently, suddenly, it wasn't for both. It was for one whose dream dress cost $18,200, whose plated steak menu cost more than my annual campus housing would have, one whose fairy tale was built with money I never got to touch. They called it a gift. They never understood it was a contract, and I made sure to enforce it. The day the board voted to dissolve Cartwright Labs, I was already gone. Not legally, I still held shares through Riso Capital, but emotionally, strategically, psychologically, I had already exited, had already shifted my capital into ventures that didn't wear names like Couture Armor. The company folded with a press release. Realignment in a post-growth market. James published a Medium post about lessons learned. He quoted Rumi. Karina posted a yoga photo with the caption, "Failure is feedback." They were always good at slogans. But the invoices don't care about captions, and the market doesn't care about the mood. A few months later, I visited my parents. I didn't tell them where I worked, didn't mention Cartwright, just brought over takeout and nodded politely when my father said, "We're just glad you found your own rhythm." He still thought I was freelancing. My mother said, "Karina's been having a rough time. She's looking for her next chapter." I nodded, then she said it. "You know, she wouldn't have made it through the divorce if not for the wedding. It gave her grounding." I looked up from my soup. "You think the wedding grounded her?" She smiled. "It gave her the strength to let go." I wanted to laugh, but I didn't. I just said, "Then I'm glad she had it, because she never will again." That fund, the one they emptied for roses and rentals, had been intended to support a future, mine. They spent it like it was decoration. I converted it back into capital, not just money, control. When I got back to my condo that night, I opened a drawer I hadn't touched in years. Inside, a photo of me at 17 holding the acceptance letter from Georgetown. I burned it. Not out of rage, but ritual, because I no longer needed the reminder. I hadn't just survived without their gift. I had turned it into the most expensive lesson they would never learn, that you don't bet against someone just because they're quiet, that you don't mock someone just because they're building slowly, that you don't spend someone's future and expect them to disappear. They didn't understand leverage, but I did. And that's why they lost. I still keep one thing from the wedding, the program pamphlet. Tucked behind it, a single note, written in my father's hand, meant for Karina's memory box. This day was possible because of love and sacrifice. He didn't know who sacrificed, but I did. And now, so does the balance sheet.